a very interesting topic, so I don't want to delay things too much, but I've got a few matters to go through. My name is Phil O'Toole, I'm the Senior Partner of Sentium, and tonight PwC and Andrew McPherson are very kindly hosting this function, which is very much appreciated. I've just got a couple of announcements to make before I introduce Andrew, who will in turn introduce Katie, our speaker tonight, and an overview of the topic. Firstly, SOPAC 2018, we're just getting over the international conference this year, but next year will be hosted in Melbourne from 20 to 23 May. So there'll be a focus on the position of the internal audit profession today in the context of business change and expectations. As always, the program will provide an array of content spread across technical, innovative and leadership topics. The pre-conference rate is currently available, so get in and register. The Grad Cert for Internal Audit, the enrolment for the 2018 intake was opened last week. If you're thinking of undertaking or think there is someone in your team or company that may be interested, please ask them. There's some flyers available here and the information will be available on the IIA internet. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew McPherson, who is the global head since the 1st of October of Internal Audit and GRC for PwC, and he will introduce our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. Hi everyone, it's super nice to see a bunch of familiar faces and have you around to our place because we spend a lot of time out at some of your places, so it is very nice to have you here. And welcome to our new digs in Barangaroo. We were talking before about how nice and open these client floors are. Don't worry, we save plenty on the team floors, didn't we, Sarah? So with hot desking and working or something, I think when we moved into our previous building almost 20 years ago, we had a quarter of people, twice the floor space we have here, so we sort of worked in 1/8 of the floor space in a 20-year period. It's kind of interesting the way that way of working and the way we work has really changed, and probably got some more change to come yet. Yeah, as Phil said, I have been working as far across our Asia Pacific business for some years, but I still very much call Australia home. It's been a nice long time and days here in Sydney in this market. But there's definitely one thing that's really clear to me, and that's that culture and conduct and behaviours are very tightly linked to brand value and reputation in any organisation, in any culture, anywhere. The world of governance standards is starting to codify this in. So previously we were focused very much on processes and controls and systems, and some things that we used to call soft are now becoming actually, in some sectors, in some countries, actually very hard requirements. And this is a topic of really high interest. It's something that exercises the mind of any board, of any audit committee, of any chief executive and any executive. It is around the conduct, the culture, and so forth in their organisation and how that impacts things. And I guess in my experience, most risks come to life and leap off a risk register into someone's day because of a behaviour, either a behaviour or the absence of a behaviour, and that's very important. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Katie Waterhouse. Katie's a manager in our team who we've relocated from our UK practice to come and bolster our capability in this space, and we've been working in this space for some years. I think as many of you know, we've talked about this before. What started with the banks probably 10, 12 years ago was when they had a challenge with their foreign currency trading in this country. As now, over the last 18 months, gone right through every industry in the country, and we're doing work for universities, government agencies, you name it. They're all looking at this quite explicitly. So I just thought it'd be great for you to hear from Katie, hear about the way some audit functions are approaching this, some of the tools and techniques that you've got available to you as you approach this topic. I won't call it this topic, I'll call it this topic. And I really encourage you to ask her questions and so forth, because she's full of perspectives about other markets through Europe and what she's seen here in Australia. So make her welcome. I'm sure you'll find tonight really interesting and hopefully really practical as we take it back to your organisations. Thank you.
I start, I just thought I'd take a moment or two just to introduce myself and give a bit of my background. So, as Andrew said, I'm Thomas Connor from the UK firm 3 months ago, and focus on culture, assessment and measurement. I've been with the firm 7 years, and started off in controls assurance, so really doing lots of IT audit, controls assurance, testing type of work. 3 to 4 years of my career. Got a little bit bored of that, didn't really excite me, if I'm too honest. And I had the opportunity to join a new team that was forming in the UK that was focused on culture and helping organisations go and assess and measure that within their business. So I've been doing that for the past 3 years, working with all lines of defence, first, second and third. And over the past couple of years, I've really been taking a particular focus in supporting internal audit functions in this, ranging from helping them to develop frameworks on auditing culture, to training and upskilling their internal audit teams, to actually going and doing some of the delivery and delivering some of the culture reviews on the audit plan. So yeah, really excited to be here, and yeah, please feel free to ask questions. We do have a session at the end for Q&A, but if you've got a burning desire to ask a question, please, please shout out. So in terms of what I thought we could cover today, bit of an overview of what is culture, our point of view, the role of internal audit in this topic, sharing some insights in terms of what internal audit functions are doing, both in Australia, in the UK, but then also globally as well, the likes of America, etc. And then just depending on where you are on your journey, just some practical hints and tips in terms of what you need to do. So if we start at the beginning and what is culture? There's a few definitions that I've put on the screen, but ultimately it's the way we do things around here. It's the systems of thinking, feeling, valuing and behaving. And this is pretty intangible. And culture can often be referred to as the personality of an organisation. It can be quite difficult to change. So when you hear of an organisation saying they're running a large culture change programme, they're probably not doing that. But what they're actually doing is they want to move some behaviours and to drive those more towards the strategy, the desires culture, the direction that the organisation wants to go in, aligned with the risk appetite. Risk, I thought I'd also just capture this as well. Since I've come over here from the UK, I've seen that risk culture is a particularly hot topic in the Australian market, more so than the UK. The UK seems to be more focused on culture, where over here I'm certainly seeing risk culture being talked about a lot. Some people see them as quite different topics, where I actually see them to be very interlinked and entwined. And the way that I view risk culture is it's the systems of your thinking, feeling, valuing, behaving, so your organisational culture. But how does that lead to the right risk taking, the right decision making, the right risk managing, and the right risk outcomes? So ultimately, it's applying a risk lens to your organisational culture. So there's quite a lot of overlap in my opinion. There was some market research done, and this was global, around what would a strong culture look like. Now, this is absolutely not exhaustive, but it's just a bit of a start of the 10 in terms of what would some of these indicators be. So there's two-way dialogue of purpose, vision, values, and behaviours. Rather than this being forced down from the top by management, what we find works well is when employees are engaged in this topic, they're able to contribute to this and participate in this. And we find from doing this, this makes people engaged, empowered to be part of it, and to drive it forward, to get on board with it, as opposed to something that feels that is done to them. Next one is positive reinforcement. And rather than focusing on some of the disciplining and reprimanding poor behaviour, actually finding that balance and recognising and rewarding good behaviour and positive behaviour, really coming back to that carrot and stick point of view. Next one is around speaking up, and this is really around creating an environment where employees feel comfortable, safe, and encouraged and empowered to speak up and raise issues or matters that concern them. Who owns culture? This is an interesting one, and you can usually get into a good debate about this. But the way that I see it is culture needs to be owned and set by the top, so the board. I then think that the executives and leadership have a responsibility and a role to play in cascading and embedding that desired culture down through their parts of the business or functions. We'll then also see various functions and parts of the business being involved in different culture interventions, initiatives, etc., the likes of HR and also risk, and then internal audit as well, particularly in this topic of auditing culture. And it's absolutely great to have that involvement. It's just really important to understand the roles and responsibilities, who's doing what, where are the linkages, overlaps, how can we potentially leverage one another's work to get to the end goal of that desired state. And then finally, having a strong linkage between strategy and your culture. This can be very powerful in helping to achieve your strategic objective and using that to your advantage. Over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of guidance, press, publications, thought leadership on the topic of culture. I just wanted to draw out a couple that I feel are particularly relevant. So the first one is one of the papers by the IIA, and this was released back in July 2016 in the UK. This was the second paper on auditing culture. The first one came out in 2014. But in 2016, the UK IIA worked with the Financial Reporting Council on the Culture Coalition to really understand what boards were doing in response to culture. And off the back end of that, they produced this paper that really started to give some tangible examples and case studies of how the different functions were going around the topic. And one thing that this did as part of that is they sent a questionnaire out to internal audit just to gather some data on that, and I'll share some of those insights with you a bit later on. And then also the APRA paper that came out October 2016 on risk culture. And this really was talking around the need for organisations to define the risk culture and what this means day to day in an individual's role, what are the behaviours that are expected of them. Really put an emphasis on the need for leadership to role model those behaviours. And it also spoke about measurement and the expectation for organisations to be able to measure and report on the risk culture within the organisation. This is particularly relevant for a lot of the APRA regulated entities as part of the CPS 220 requirements, which is really looking for organisations to have that view and the board to understand what's happening from a risk culture perspective in the organisation. We're also aware that next year APRA is going to be performing 5 pilot risk culture reviews across a sample of ADIs, insurance and superannuation firms towards the end of 2018. While this is a pilot next year, we do believe it is going to be part of BAU going forward. And they have hired an organisational psychologist that's driving this work. From our point of view, so when I work with organisations, I don't go and say, you've got a good culture or you've got a bad culture. Organisations will have different cultures, and each one will be unique. If I just talk about my experiences of PwC London versus PwC Sydney, it's the same firm, it's the same PwC umbrella, but there are different ways of working. There are similarities, but there are differences. And so it's very difficult to compare like for like, company to company. What we really focus on is alignment and how strong or weak a culture is. So we really do this by looking at 3 things. So what is your intended culture? So what are your purpose, vision, values? what is the desired culture? How is this being set from the top? What is the strategy and how does that all come together? The next is your expressed culture. And this is looking at how the organisation has set itself up physically to achieve that desired state, that desired culture. And so this is really your policies, processes, procedures, controls that are in place that you can use to help get you from where you are to where you want to be. And then finally, we've got actual culture. What is happening on the ground day to day? What are the behaviours that employees are demonstrating? Now, if you have a strong culture, you'd have alignment between those three pillars. If it is that it's a weak culture, that's where you would have misalignment. And just to bring this to life with an example, it's one that I use quite frequently, is if you have a value of putting the customer at the heart of everything you do, or treating customers fairly, for example. But the way that the organisation has set itself up around remuneration, compensation, performance management, etc., is that it's very target-driven, very bonus focused. That could potentially lead to an employee mis-selling a product to a customer so that they will achieve their bonus and they meet their targets. But ultimately, that wasn't the right thing for the customer. And therefore, going back to the value and the management's expectations from the top of putting the customer at the heart of everything we do, that's where there's the misalignment. So that's just one practical example. This slide just really talks about the middle layer, so the intended culture. And this is absolutely not exhaustive, but just starts to show or share just some different examples of the different behavioural reinforcers that you can pull within an organisation to drive and to influence that behaviour. So leadership action, looking at tone from the top. Is there clarity of the purpose, vision, values? Role modelling. Our leadership, are they walking the walk and talking the talk? Is there consistency and cohesiveness of leadership? Are they delivering the same messages, or are they potentially going off after their own agenda a little bit? Next one is around communication. This is, as I'm sure you all know, it's absolutely vital in an organisation. But really looking at two-way communication. How are messages being cascaded down from the top, from the board? How are they being cascaded to middle management and then to all staff? But then vice versa, how are messages from the bottom being fed up to the organisation? What are the channels and the mechanisms that help and promote and encourage that openness, that speak-up culture? People practices. So this is really your end-to-end employee life cycle, starting from recruitment and onboarding, touching training and development, all the way through to succession planning and exit interviews. But it's how can some of those processes help to achieve that desired state? Performance management. So this, while it is absolutely part of people practices, we do believe that it's significant in its own right to actually draw it out as its own individual reinforcer, if that makes sense. So just thinking around performance linkage to rewards, recognition, your performance framework, how does behaviour feed into that in terms of the 2B state? So it's getting more common that as part of your performance, your balanced scorecard, as part of your end of year performance, it very much used to be very financial metrics, target driven. What have you done? It wasn't really looking at the how have you done this. So we're now starting to see much more of a balance or an inclusion of behaviours and the qualitative side being incorporated in that. So that's just another example. And then organisational structure. So how about talking about risk management and the lines of defence, the control environment, and also the governance and decision-making frameworks. These are all ways of which can help influence the behaviour, along with the external environment and what the organisation stands for. So the relationship with society, perception, relationship with the regulator and the customer, the view on sustainability, etc. Now, when we assess culture, there's a wide variety of techniques that you can use, and it really is a combination of qualitative and quantitative. And I'll just quickly go around the wheel just to illustrate some of those. I don't believe that you can really look at culture if you don't speak to people. You need to understand what's going on, what are they facing day to day, what are they thinking, feeling, believing, valuing, etc. So absolutely holding focus groups with employees and interviews with leadership, gathering their perceptions and also starting to peel away at the onion to understand some of the behavioural root causes that are happening. Going and performing behavioural observations. So there are key interactions, moments that happen where key decisions are made. So for instance, in a moderation or a performance promotion meeting, or in a key governance committee meeting, all those behaviours that management expect being lived out day to day in practice, not only at the leadership level, but across all layers. Looking at KPIs and data, so your metrics and data, there is so many out there that can give you a view of culture. It's just really understanding where they are and what is it that it's telling you. So just some typical examples could be the employee engagement survey, for instance, turnover, disciplinary data, time in grade, completion of mandatory training. They're just to name a few, but it's just working with HR in the business just to understand what potentially you could look at. Sample-based inspection. This may be where you want to do some operating effectiveness testing. So it may be looking at consistency of how the policy or procedure has actually been implemented. If it is that, I'll come back to the disciplinary action, but if you have two individuals, employees, that have had a similar conduct breach, for example, how have they been reprimanded? Is it consistent? Is there variation in that? So that's just another approach to look at. Psychometric testing and tools. Now, this is one that's definitely an exception rather than a typical norm. Some organisations, as part of the recruitment process, ask candidates rather to complete a values-based questionnaire, and this really is to assess the alignment between a personal or an individual's values versus the organisation's values. If they're not aligned, then they typically wouldn't be invited to the next round. Employee surveys. This is really powerful in terms of gathering some quantitative data quite quickly across a large population. The risk that we have with this is around survey fatigue. It's one that we're kind of facing. There's lots of surveys, employee engagement surveys, full surveys, etc. So it needs to be done at the right time, and if it's right for the organisation, it will really depend case by case. Desktop reviews and walkthroughs, so very audit techniques, understanding policies, processes, procedures, walking through end-to-end how they have been designed to reinforce the desired culture, that to-be state, and how essentially it's operating in practice. And then finally, customer voice. This is really powerful. What's the customer satisfaction? What's the customer feedback of the organisation? So there is no right or wrong way in terms of which techniques you should use, but it really does need to be the combination of both. From the UK, we've found if you go down a purely qualitative route, management seems to be not quite comfortable with that, based on perception, for instance. So they like some of the hard data, the quantitative data, to support that as well. You can also use surveys, again, to help reinforce that quantitative data. So the role of internal audit. So we're seeing an increasing expectation from the board and from senior management for internal audit functions to provide some form of cultural assurance or a view of the culture within the organisation. Several years ago, there was, when culture became a hot topic, it basically went to HR as a first point of call. It's culture, people, they marry up, they work together, so you can understand that thought mechanism. But HR own and drive a lot of the behavioural reinforcers, say performance management, training, onboarding, induction, objectives, etc., you name it. So there's potentially a bit of a conflict between them and actually assessing what they implement and design, etc. So I really feel that internal audit is well placed to look at culture. There is a lot of value that can be provided from this. So the first one is providing the audit committee and the board with an independent view of the culture within the organisation. Also, you're working with the business day to day. You know the business, you understand the business, you understand where the cultural hotspots are. You have those cultural insights just from your day-to-day interactions. And that having that insight is really powerful to understand where to look and understand what's going on. Also, the ability to get under the surface and to understand the cultural and behavioural root causes. So, as auditors, we're good at finding issues, and it's not just around understanding what went wrong, but carry on peeling around that layer to understand why that actually happened, to get down to that next layer and to get to the root cause. And then also being independent of the business. It's really helpful to apply their professional skepticism, to challenge more than what others would potentially do, and to take that independent position to identify some issues more clearly. It's also really valuable just to help the business understand where are their areas of good behaviour, but then also poor behaviour. How is those areas of their strength? How are they helping drive the organisation? And then where there's areas of poor behaviour, how are they having a potentially detrimental impact on the business, and what is the risk of that? So just understanding from a performance and reputational perspective, by looking at culture, it's around understanding how embedded are behaviours that management expect embedded across all layers of the organisation, the extent to that's happening, and what needs to be done for the areas where that isn't consistent. This slide just really talks around some key principles for assessing culture based on what we've been doing over the past few years on the topic. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach to auditing culture. It really does depend on the organisation, on what will work for you and what you're wanting to achieve. It really needs to be bespoke and tailored. And it really does vary, and we'll come on to just some examples, and hopefully this will really illustrate the different approaches that organisations are taking. The next point is to clarify your cultural aspiration. So you know you want to do something, but what is it that you actually want to look at? What is it that you're auditing? Are you looking at culture? Are you looking at risk culture? Are you looking at something different? And then once you have that objective, what is it that you're actually assessing against? Is it the company values? Is it a set of behaviours that the organisation has? It could be a competency framework. It could be strategic objectives or priorities. It could be risk behaviours. Really, again, just depends on what will work. But it's really important once those decisions have been made to apply it consistently. Number 3, this really comes back to what we were discussing earlier around the alignment and how important that is. So what is it that's expected at the top? How does the organisation set itself up to achieve this? And what is actually happening in practice? How are people behaving? Number 4 is around taking a risk-based approach. And so what we've seen work well is where internal audit incorporate cultural risk into the annual planning process and the annual risk assessment. And this really helps to focus the attention on areas where potentially there is higher cultural risk, which potentially could be an area of focus if it was that you wanted to go down and to do a bit more of a deep dive into that particular area. Utilise a combination of audit approaches. So, and I'll come on to this on the next slide, but there are different ways of doing this, but we generally see 1 or 2 that are being done. Either a standalone deep dive culture review into a particular area, or the component piece where you apply a cultural lens to your existing audits, your regular, more traditional audits. Number 6 is around drawing a variety of data from the different sources. So using a combination of the qualitative and quantitative techniques, be it speaking to people in focus groups and interviews, looking at your KPIs and data, performing process walkthroughs and documentation review, behavioural observations, as we mentioned earlier. But finding that right balance and pulling it all together. And then on pulling it all together, number 7 is what are the themes that are arising from the work that's being done? What are the messages? how can I present that to the audit committee and to the board? What are the key challenges that we're seeing and how can we help them move forward? So culture is pervasive and it's everywhere in an organisation. It touches everything. And depending on the size of the organisation, I'm fairly confident to say it's feasibly pretty much impossible to audit culture in one go. And so generally, you need to have a combination of approaches to get breadth and to get depth, to get the audit coverage that you need. So, as I mentioned, generally see organisations doing one or two. So, number one is the discrete reviews. So, this is a standalone audit focusing specifically on culture. This could be in a particular business unit, department, team, location, just depending on where potentially there is higher cultural risk. And these are great in terms of really getting under the surface in that particular area to get depth and richness. But given the limitation in terms of scope, time, etc., there may be, you might not get the breadth. And so maybe that you perform a couple a year, for example. Where the component reviews, this is about applying a cultural lens to your regular, more traditional audits. This way you're able to get the breadth. However, you might not necessarily get the breadth because you're not going into the same level of detail as you would in a standalone culture audit. So this could be including some culture questions as part of your regular audits. It may be collecting some culture KPIs and actually having a look what does that mean. If you're doing this, it's really important to understand what you're looking for and what the output of it is and how do you pull all of this together. You absolutely get the breadth because you're covering multiple audits throughout the year. So that's why we kind of feel that you need a combination of both to get that breadth and that depth. And then number three is around the consolidation piece. So pulling it all together, looking at the themes that are coming out of this, the thematic analysis, and what does this ultimately say about the culture of the organisation, and how can we present that potentially in an annual summary to the board or to the audit committee? From my experience, I'm seeing organisations, if they're doing something, are doing one or two, maybe doing one and two in an ideal world, but they're not quite there at three. They haven't done enough, and it's still new, to be able to have sufficient data to be able to do three. So I do feel that that's something that potentially will change over the next year in 2018. So it'd be really great to see how that evolves. So what are internal audit functions doing? So I mentioned the IIA paper on auditing culture, which was released at I think it was July last year. And as part of that, they sent out the list of the questionnaire to a range of heads of internal audit, just to gather some data on what are you doing. And so there was this question that was, does your audit plan include any aspect of culture on it? So the results, please bear in mind, this was 18 months ago when the data was gathered, and it was very UK perspective, but I just thought it would be helpful just to share some insights with you. So 32% have incorporated culture within standard audits. 7 are conducting the standalone discrete audits. 16% were doing a combination of both. 18% had planned to audit culture now this year, and 27% were doing nothing. Can I just put or ask for a quick show of hands? Who's doing culture within your standard audits, or who's looking at culture within your standard audits? Who's doing standalone culture audits? Anyone doing a combination of both? Who's planning on doing something in 2018? And nothing. A lot of you didn't put your hand up as well. So I'm not sure what I missed there. So This slide just really illustrates across industries the different approaches that some internal audit functions are taking. And hopefully this illustrates that there is no one size fits all. It does need to be tailored and bespoke to the organisation. This is a combination of Australian organisations, global, UK, so just to kind of demonstrate that breadth. So starting with the Global Pharmaceuticals Organisation, they are probably one of the most kind of thought leading in this space, progressive in this space. They've been doing this for a good 5 years. They have developed a values assurance team within their IA function that's been led by an organisational psychologist. It's a very senior team, so it's generally director and above, and they have sourced people from across the business to do that. They, as well as externally, they defined a framework around understanding how embedded the values were within the organisation, and they will essentially go around the globe, business by business, area by area, to look at that. So this is their full-time job. I think there's around a team of 7 that essentially do that as part of their day-to-day job. One of the small UK banks, so they started to develop a framework that, rather than culture per se and values, what was really important to them was their strategic priorities. And they, as part of the planning process for all of your regular audits, they were required to collect a variety of cultural metrics and as part of each audit. And if those metrics reached some predefined tolerances that were aligned to the strategic priorities, that would then prompt a culture deep dive in that area. That was one way for them to identify high cultural risk, for example. Australian University, they have just recently undertaken a risk culture diagnostic, and they targeted it at 2 Sydney campuses. They didn't want to go down the survey route because they'd just gone through a recent employee engagement survey, so there was a real risk of survey fatigue. So they decided to conduct interviews and focus groups with a sample of staff across those 2 campuses. And also in those interviews and focus groups, they asked the participants to complete a risk culture questionnaire so that they could get some quantitative data as well. The Australian insurance company, they had a similar approach, but they also spent quite a lot of time doing a desktop review, so really understanding from a policies, processes, procedures perspective how that has been designed to reinforce that design state. Small governance agency. So the board had an ask of the internal audit function. Where are we on risk culture? What are we doing? Where are we strong? Where are we weak? What do we need to focus on? So internal audit came in and they did some workshops, and they also used a survey as well to gather that data. The output of that is it resulted in quite a detailed action plan of some initiatives that wanted to be taken forward to address some of those findings. A global manufacturing business, they really wanted to understand how HR's 3 strategic objectives were encouraging and driving positive behavioural change, and how that overall led to enhanced performance of the organisation, if it did. And in doing this, they really use a combination of the qualitative and quantitative techniques, so the focus groups and interviews, but then they also rely quite extensively on some of the KPIs and data that was there. So there'd been quite a lot of incidents that had happened, so they used a lot of their incident MI and reporting to corroborate some of those findings. The Australian big bank, I quite like this story. So they developed a framework probably about 3 years ago over auditing culture, and they worked with their risk function to have that framework and their risk behaviours. And they did a pilot into one area of the bank, and As part of that, there was a few teething problems. Some things worked well, some things didn't work well, and they refined their approach. So they did this pilot and made those refinements. Last year, they delivered 13 risk culture reviews across the bank, not just in Australia, but New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Asia, etc. And then on the plan this year, they've now grown to, they now want to do around 30 reviews on their plan. So quite a nice story to see how they have evolved. They've learned as they've gone. And one thing that I feel they did quite well is they did a pilot on themselves. And it wasn't necessarily the first audit, but they have actually audited themselves, and this has really helped them go to management and say, this is a tried and tested approach. We've done this. This is the outcome. This is the value that it provides, and it's a way to be able to credentialise themselves in doing that. And then just another example is the mid-tier bank. And so they did an assessment as part of, they looked at culture as part of every audit. And they essentially asked the audit team to complete a template, which was a combination of questions, but then also some KPIs that were standardised as well. And then once they did that at the end of every year, they pulled all the data together to understand what were some of the key messages that was happening. And the outcome was ultimately related back to the organisation's values. So in terms of what you need to do, I think there are 5 key areas to focus on. So the first one is to establish a clear mandate for auditing culture and to obtain senior buy-in, not only from the very start, but all the way throughout the engagement and the reviews. And I can't re-emphasise enough how critical this is. I've seen it where it doesn't work, and I've seen it where it does. And by having that management buy-in, you're really setting yourself up for success. The next one is to articulate the assurance need and the value that can be provided from doing this. But it's also really important to understand management's expectations. What do they want to get out of this? What is the purpose of them, you coming into that particular area, for example? And it's really important to understand the different cultural initiatives in place across the organisation. Who's doing what from what perspective? What is the business doing? What is risk doing? What is HR doing? Leverage, build upon, work together to build a robust approach. The next one is around developing the cultural framework, and I'll say it again, but it is bespoke. There is no one size fits all. It does need to be tailored to what will work for you. And to determine what to audit against, be it values, be it behaviours, be it strategic objectives or competency framework, management capability, for example, and then to apply those consistently. And consider the different approach that you may want to go down. Is it a deep dive, standalone, specific audit? Or is it potentially applying that cultural lens as part of your component piece? Do what works for you. Trial it, pilot it, start small, and then you can increase it as it grows once you learn from it. Techniques. So, as I mentioned, use a combination of qualitative and quantitative techniques to gather the data. It is subjective. You do need to speak to people. And when you do speak to people, don't be afraid to probe into some of those answers. Get to the bottom of it. Get some case studies. Get some examples. Get some quotes. This is really powerful when it comes to reporting. Also understand what cultural data is already available across the organisation. There is so much. It's just pulling it all together and understanding what does this mean. Number 4, appropriate skill set. So auditing culture, typical internal audit skill set. There is a lot of judgment and interpretation, subjective, but with the right training, support, input, guidance, some of these skills can be learned and can be developed. I was in audit. I now do this. From my personal experience, I was very comfortable with the black and the white. pass and fail, not so comfortable with the grey and the judgmental, and it's really about taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and so what does this mean for the organisation? What is the risk? And so I feel that probably took me a year to get really comfortable with, to be able to do that with the right coaching support, etc. But I think there is an initial skill set that you need, and then you can develop as you become more experienced on the topic. We're also seeing some organisations hiring organisational or behavioural psychologists to actually go and lead this work. I know that's the case in Australia and in the UK. So that's generally where I'm seeing it. I haven't heard anywhere else that is doing it yet. But what we are seeing is a multidisciplinary team. So if you have organisational psychologists, there's also experts or experience from HR. There's also internal audit experience. There's risk and control experience. And it's marrying up that team that really helps to end product. And then the next point, and the final point, is around reporting and clearance. Now, I generally find that a culture report won't look and feel the same as your typical internal audit report. We don't generally give a rating, for example, when we help our clients. We find that it is very subjective and can be quite challenging to do, so it's more of a review and recommend. And in doing so, we've also found that it's potentially driven some of the wrong behaviour as well, so it is a little bit counterintuitive of what we're trying to achieve. With reporting, and one of the kind of exceptions to from your typical internal audit, rather than just reporting by exception, focus on the good as well. Don't just focus on the areas of improvement. With culture, it's so important to understand what your cultural strengths are and to build upon those, just focus on those. You run the risk, if you start focusing on the areas of improvement, the good falls away. And some findings can be quite sensitive and need to be handled quite carefully. There may be findings that come up around the perception of leadership. And if it is that your sponsor is around them, then there needs to be time taken to position, handle, manage, and work through that appropriately. We also find that when you have a debrief meeting with your client, and these are some of the findings that have come out, generally they're quite accepted. But then when you actually put them down on paper, it looks and feels very different. So just being mindful that it can be quite challenging, but that's why it's really important to get that buy-in from the very beginning, have those key touch points throughout the audit, their clear on outcomes, objectives, etc. That really helps streamline that transition and to ease that reporting going forward. And then just to wrap up, so the focus on culture is here to stay. I hope so. I'm here for the next couple of years. The board and management are expecting more. We are seeing the likes of AFA really pushing for the board to do more on this topic. And what we've seen in the UK is this has really pushed them to look to internal audit to provide that guidance and that view. I won't reiterate the point, but do what will work for your organisation. There is no one tried and tested approach. Work with management to establish the audit mandate and obtain their buy-in and support and manage their expectations. And 5, understand the cultural initiatives and data that already exists across the organisation and how can you potentially leverage that to your advantage. And then also just consider what skills you need. What are some of the skills within your internal audit teams? Are there potential gaps? How would you go about doing this? So that's all I have. So please feel free to ask me any questions and we can do a Q&A.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think we're all very enthused now in terms of getting cultural audits onto our audit program. Just one question, Katie. Going back to point 4 there, which I think is one of the most, particularly in light of the lack of show of hands at the current level of acceptance within organisations. and the varying levels of maturity with audit committee chairs and executives. What tips can the people take away today to get that mandate to sell to their audit committees and executives the value coming out of it?
Before I answer that, I think just one insight that we found really powerful was the role of the non-executive directors. They are generally on various boards. In the UK, it was very driven from a financial services perspective, what would happen with LIBOR, FX, etc. So if you had a NED on a banking board and they were more on the front foot with this, and if they had a view that this is what they were doing, but then they go to another client or another organisation, say oil and gas or pharma or manufacturing, well, they're doing this. What are we doing on this? And that really helped get the conversation going. To your question, it's really around articulating the value and going with kind of a solution and an output and having confidence in what it is that you want to achieve and the value of that. Being able to, you understand an issue may have happened within the business that you're aware of. And naturally, if there's internal audit are frequently asked to go in and to do an investigation into that particular area, maybe just take a step back and challenge that approach. And what was there a behavioural element to that? Did a system go wrong? Did a process or a control fail? But was there a human element to that as well? And so that can also be quite powerful. So just think about what you're currently doing, and if there is anything that you could potentially do to apply that behavioural lens.
Yeah, look, just to ease your mind a bit, about 9 or 20 years ago, I did put a toe in the water around cultural auditing with the help of PwC at that time, and this is when I was head of audit with the bank. But since I retired, I think it sort of faded away. Yeah. But the reason I picked it up, and I'm surprised you didn't talk about it strongly today, is the relationship between culture and effective internal control. Yeah. Because I think the two are,
absolutely
so linked, and I think that's why, as auditors, we need to be a bit more involved in culture.
Yeah, most definitely. And so that's like your going back to your intended culture. Sorry, not your intended, your express culture. So your policies, processes, controls, and the role that they have to play in that. Yeah.
But just as individuals too, because I remember doing we used to add on some cultural questions during our audits. Yeah. And at the end of the audit, maybe sit down with these managers of that area and say, look, some interesting things come out of our questions. Yeah. And they were fairly simple questions, but talking about the morale of your staff, are scared to actually report errors, etc., etc. Yeah. And I think those sorts of things that come out were very, very much of interest to the audit.
Most definitely, and that's what we're kind of seeing from that component piece. I think the point is, what do you do with that, and how do you report that back to management?
My dad is a psychologist. Well, he's a teacher for that. But he emphasised the change over time, and he was particularly fond of saying that taking a particular snapshot at any point in time is jolly difficult, but if you can compare. So if you've been in an organisation a couple of years and you can compare a unit or a group from one period to the next, you can then talk about whether the culture had improved or not.
Yeah, most definitely.
So is that something that you might?
Most, and so as with any typical audit, you'll go in and see at a later date how that has evolved and how that's changed, how have the recommendations or the findings been addressed. That's something that we're starting to see because it's still in its, people are starting to do this, but most definitely the value of internal audit is you do have a starting point, you know where you want to get to. A year later, this is where you are. A year later after that, this is where you are. I think unlike some quick wins in terms of addressing a control failure potentially, behavioural change does take time. So it's also finding the right time to go back in and to understand what has changed.
just want to know, both want to obtain comfortable with the sound structure of the organization. And when we see financial costs reviews, that could possibly be a reflection of risk high risk culture efficiency. What do you think we can do to ensure that the organization is demonstrating a sound structure and then presenting that to your
So I think firstly there needs to be a defined end state. So the desired risk culture, what does that look like? And then underpinning that, there are behaviours across all levels, so be it your execs, be it your managers, and be it your staff, so that employees understand what is expected of them day to day. You can then use that framework as the basis to understand how embedded those behaviours are across the organisation, and to review some of the more design effectiveness pieces of work. How are the policies, processes, procedures set up, designed to reinforce that risk culture framework that the organisation has and they want to get to?
Hi, Ashley from Westpac Internal Audit.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, how do you speak about building the credibility with the executive leadership team? But I guess how does audit go about kind of building that credibility, and like where's the entry point? Like, should we be just focusing on culture in every review, looking at some of those metrics, etc., versus doing the culture deep dives? Like, how do we kind of build up our approach over time? I'm thinking more like over the next year to 3 years. Like, what's the starting point?
It's a good question. I think one of the best starting points is to actually do a bit of the design effectiveness review. And, if it is that you've got strong values and you've got the behaviours, how are they incorporated, embedded in some of your key policies, processes, and procedures? Because if they aren't, then how will employees know how to behave? So I actually think a setup or a startup audit would actually be really valuable. We didn't really see that in the UK, but from our experience, in hindsight, I think that would have been a really good place to start.
So looking at some of the more hard controls.
Well, some of the more hard controls, exactly, yeah. So your code of conduct, for example, or your performance management framework, your induction. So what does it feel to work at Westpac? And what's expected of them day to day, regular value training, for example, just depending on what it is.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a question about basically you said opening up during the process to internal audit. How do you propose the method to do it?
So when we go and do these reviews, so let's say we do the focus groups and interviews, it's absolutely fundamental that you reinforce confidentiality. And you do have the position that you are independent of the business. So when we, let's just say I was internal audit, I'm doing a review, I would get the sample of people that were part of that area. I would pick the sample. The business would not have sight of who had been invited. When we do the focus groups and interviews, we do take notes, but it's purely from our own perspective, so we can pull all the data together. Everything is captured on a no-names basis. Nothing will be attributable to any individual, and we only report themes that where there is a content to the theme. We won't report an individual or make a comment about what one person has said. And just really reinforcing that as well. And then with the focus groups, we generally run them across peers, so that you're encouraging an environment to speak freely, so that you would want potentially your line manager in the same focus group, for example.
Just wondering, what's the destination of cultural organization? So companies say, how about the compliance culture? That's all I need. Like what I do cultural audit, I think there's another layer of destination that the style management they would achieve. That's what we are done. You can sell it for.
I'm not quite sure what your question is.
What's the destination of
So where's it going?
Yeah, destinations. So what's the end game?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that.
Well, putting it the other way, so if the company has a good compliance culture, is then this sort of company can free of the culture.
It's like a culture appetite, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
a set of risk appetite.
So my question to you is, how do you know that you've got a good compliance culture?
Well, if a company runs a regular audit compliance program, so by and large, those programs were validated by internal audit. So where we go from there, on that basis.
My view is culture is more than compliance. So culture is about strategy, it's about reputation, it's about trust in society. It's not about a compliance exercise. So I do feel that they are quite different.
So time for one more question. I thought someone was going to ask a question about what's going on in Canberra at the moment with dual citizenship and then how you get rid of that. But
I have no
idea. Any other final questions, Chester?
Have you ever been asked by senior management of boards on which organizations have the best culture and which organizations have a culture that they should not follow?
All the time. Yeah, all the
And
time.
do you have a point of view or?
Because coming back to what I said at the start, culture is it's unique to that one organisation. So the culture of Westpac to ANZ to CBA, they will all have very different cultures. That's just the way of how the business is set up. So what we would be able to give an indication of is who potentially has a stronger culture, but that culture is specific to that one organisation, not how they would compare across industry, for example. So we generally wouldn't answer good or bad. We focus on the alignment piece.
Well, once again, thanks, Katie, very much for a fantastic presentation. Excellent. As you can tell by the number of questions which you generated afterwards. I would like once again to thank PwC for hosting tonight's event, which is also presented and facilitated by the New South Wales chapter of the IIA, which I'm a member of. We have chapter chair down here, Charlie Whittaker, and vice chair, Chris Benecki. So please, we put on a lot of activities throughout the year, such as this, get you suggestions to get you membership. So could you please have a chat to Charlie, Chris, and myself during the break, as well as your networking. And thank you once again.
Oh, sorry. One final thing is we actually are publishing a paper from the IA next month based around the UK, the Chartered Institute of Internal Audit, providing that paper on risk culture. We are providing a paper that reflects the environment in Australia around culture and the internal audit culture. So please look out for that one and contact us if you'd like to discuss it. Thank you.
We'll now partake of PwC's hospitality culture. Thank you very much.